Just you today, Kayla?
I guess so.
Oh, no. Here we go. Who's this? Kevin. Aha. Excellent. We'll wait another minute, just see if anyone else comes into class. Excuse me. All right, well, we'll make a start. So today we're starting chapter 10, which is the nutrition information. And I have to confess that I've been taking a look. There does seem to be some new info as I was flicking through it over lunch, which I certainly don't have a good handle on yet, so I'll have to apologize for that. I did notice if you go to that kind of fronts page for chapter 10, that there are some different and additional learning objectives for the chapter. And I didn't have time to update that slide yet, so just make sure that you go back, don't use the objectives slide, go back and look at the page in the book, okay? So we've got what they define as 6 food groups. So that's carbs, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and then they include water as a food group. Even though it doesn't have any calories, it's the variable that we can't live for very long without. We can do without the others for a couple of weeks, but we can't survive more than a couple of days without water. So, and this information in this chapter ties back very closely to the chapters we did at the beginning of the semester on energy systems. So chapter 2 on the anaerobic energy systems and chapter 3 on the aerobic ATP production. Okay? So, carbohydrate has 4 kilocalories per gram, so it doesn't have a lot of energy for a gram of carbohydrate. But remember, the cool thing about carbs is they're relatively small molecules, so when we look at glycolysis, it's very easy to break down glucose and glycogen versus trying to break down a fat or a protein that's such a bigger molecule, okay? And so the American Dietetic Association recommendations, and this is a little bit like the FIT situation, right? The range of carbs is 45 to 65% of the total calorie intake, all right? But that doesn't mean that that would be the range that you would use, right? You've got to find your range within that. So 45 should be the lowest, and 65 is really the highest. For a typical individual who's maybe just moderately active or in an office type job, the lower end of this range is much more a typical pick. So 45 to 50% of your dietary intake would be carbohydrate. The higher percentages allow us to use the same range for athletes as well, which is useful, right? So the recommended dietary amount is 300 grams a day. I don't like the RDA as much as a tool. I think maybe it's just me. I don't find the picture of 300 grams as easy to visualize or to kind of consider when I look at a meal as the idea of 45 to 50%. So for carbs, I really like for all of them really, I like the percentages of calorie intake. And then, you know, if I have a bad day and I eat a ton of carbs, then the next day I know I've got to cut back on my carbs, right? It's the preferred energy source for aerobic work because it converts to ATP, as we mentioned, twice as quickly as proteins or fats because they're so much bigger, all right? It allows for a faster, sustainable pace, all right? So if we're looking at higher intensity aerobic activities, then, you know, like 60% of your VO2 max or higher, then it's certainly preferred. Think about crossover concepts that we talked about earlier in the semester. Those play a big role in this chapter as well. It produces more ATP for a unit of oxygen, so it's more efficient at using that oxygen. All right. A low-fat, high-fiber diet is recommended for health benefits, although if you read this chapter carefully, there's clearly some new research coming out that is, I wouldn't say contradicting that, but it's coming, there's research specifically for elite athletes that seems to disagree a little bit with the health picture, okay? When we're doing prolonged exercise, so let's say about an hour of hard exercise results in about 55% liver glycogen depletion. If you do 2 hours of strenuous exercise, then it's likely that muscle glycogen and liver glycogen are likely to be pretty much fully depleted. And glycogen depletion is linked to fatigue and therefore reduced performance. And we'll come back to that idea a bit later, but you know, we want to try not to run out of glycogen if we can help it if we're an endurance athlete. It's also important as an energy source for certain anaerobic exercise. Remember that in glycolysis, the predominant food source is carbohydrate. If you go back to, I think it's in chapter 3, we had that little flow chart. There is a way to get glycerol into glycolysis via some other mediated routes, and also glycolytic amino acids. But those are not the predominant substrates. For glycolysis, glucose and glycogen are the predominant substrates, right? So if I'm doing repeated sprints, for example, or if I'm doing resistance training, particularly if it's high reps and more than one set, then we see depletion of glycogen, particularly in the type 2 muscle fibers that would be doing a lot of the work in a resistance program, right? So another reason we want to make sure we've got carbohydrate in our diet is that the minimum glucose requirement, it's estimated, so this would be an average, right? There would be individual differences here, but the average is about 130 grams per day. And so the brain preferably will use glucose for energy, and that's why if you're hungry, right, or your blood sugar is low and you're feeling a little bit loopy, and it's hard to concentrate or make good decisions because your blood sugar's low and your brain's like, I need some more glucose, okay? Oh, I need that page later. All right. And there's a really good quote, I think, on page 295, just as a reminder, because sport nutrition and just dieting in general, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not a specialist in this. The health guidelines for nutrition make a lot of sense to me, but once we get into technical sport nutrition tweaks, it's getting a bit outside my expertise. But they do make the statement that it's clearly established that carbohydrate metabolism and therefore carbohydrate inclusion in your diet is important for aerobic performance and high intensity, high duration anaerobic type activities. So like an anaerobic training setup, interval training or a HIIT training program also will predominantly use carbohydrate, okay? So if I'm doing an old-fashioned type weight training program, it's less important, but not important, okay? So this graph comes from a different textbook, but I really like how it's set up and showing the... Sorry, I'm just noticing that I probably have the wrong PowerPoint show up, but never mind. This one is a piece of research that's indicating what happens to your muscle glycogen stores if you are on a low carbohydrate diet. So remember that the range is 45 to 65 according to the Dietetic Association, all right? So in this study, they put the low carb diet at 40% and the high carb diet at 70%. That's a lot of carbs, right? And so what they were looking at was what happens on those two types of diet. So you can see here that during a training bout, we get a big drop in stored glycogen. So that's a 2-hour training block there. And then we have a full day before the next 2-hour training block. And the person on the, so here's our starting point, the person on the low carb diet doesn't really even resynthesize half of what they used in the program. And the high carb diet person is basically back to square one, right? So then we do, then we do day 2 of our training session, and we have the drop and day 2 of our diet, right? And you can see that after a few days, the person on the low carb diet, their muscle glycogen stores are very low, right? So that means for this person, they're going to be feeling quite sluggy, training's going to be very difficult, their legs will feel heavy, right? They won't have a lot of energy, and the person on the high carb diet is just chugging along as if they weren't doing any training at all, right? They're getting full resynthesis every day. Okay. So, how do we maintain carbohydrate stores, right? So, for most athletes who are in training, their carbs will need to be 50% or more of their calorie intake, particularly during high volume training periods, right? So if you look at your training plan, your periodized plan, during those very high volume, high intensity type periods, the carbs will go up in the diet, and during a rest phase or during a low, moderate intensity phase, the carbs would be lower, right? So that's something to pay attention to, I think, is that more and more the indication is you don't just fix a diet and that's what you eat the same all the time, right? You have to start tying your diet in to which training phase you're in, okay? For strength, power type athletes, the recommendation is between 55 to 60% during their high volume period, and for endurance athletes can be up to 65. Remember though that these are still within that range, so we haven't gone outside the recommended range for carbs, okay? For any athlete, if they're not taking in enough carbohydrate in their diet, then we can see fatigue, an inability to maintain training intensity, so I can't maintain the workload that I'm supposed to be doing in that day's training program, okay? Over time, we could see a loss of muscle mass because we're not training so hard, right? And we see inferior physiological adaptation. So if you think about all the adaptations we've talked about that we're training for, those are going to be less than we would expect for the amount of training. Okay? So when we're looking at this percentage of carbohydrate, then we've got to consider what kind of carbohydrate that is. Okay? And for health reasons, as well as for performance reasons, complex carbs are preferred. So vegetables, grains, fruits are much better for anyone than simple carbohydrates like sodas and candy. Okay? Complex carbs tend to have a lot more fiber in them, and we can't digest fiber, but that fiber slows down the digestion and absorption of the carbohydrate. And that means we get a slow, kind of steady drip feed into the bloodstream rather than a dramatic blood sugar spike, which is always followed by an equally dramatic blood sugar drop because it stimulates the production of insulin, and insulin moves the sugar out of the bloodstream into the tissues. Right? So at rest, it's believed that complex carbohydrates are more likely to get stored as glycogen and replenish glycogen stores if you've been training. Simple carbs break down very quickly. They're immediately absorbed into the bloodstream. We get this dramatic insulin response, and so then we get a glucose crash afterwards, right? And interestingly, the research indicates that simple carbs are more likely to get stored as triglyceride rather than glycogen, right? So these simple carbohydrates, soda, candy, are more likely to make you fat than if you eat vegetables, grains, rice, etc. Right? Doesn't mean you have to cut them out completely, though. Okay, I would not advocate a complete. Well, I would advocate a complete cut out of soda because it's a waste of time, and it's really not good for you. But you know, having some candy or having some ice cream or whatever, you know, sweet you like to treat yourself to, I wouldn't say that you can't never have that. It just shouldn't be a major choice for carbohydrate, right? So this graph shows the relationship between carbohydrate intake and endurance performance and glycogen content. All right. So here is, if I'm on a normal diet, so I'm on, let's say, my 50% carbs, then my muscle glycogen is going to be quite good, and my time to exhaustion in this particular experiment is 100 minutes. Okay? If I'm on a low carbohydrate diet, so less than 45, but on some of those low carbohydrates you're way below 40, you know, you're down in the 30s, then my initial muscle glycogen is very low, and my time to exhaustion, that's probably around 60, 65 minutes. So quite a lot quicker to get to fatigue, right? And then on the high carb diet, I've got full glycogen storage in the muscle tissue, and it's taking me somewhere around 175, 180 minutes. So again, quite a lot more time to exhaustion. So this kind of indicates how important it is that your diets have sufficient carbohydrate in them. Okay? So, one of the things I noticed is that this edition of the textbook has moved the glycemic index information up to the beginning of the chapter. So I'm a little out of whack with the chapter, but the information is the same, okay? So glycemic index measures blood sugar 2 hours after ingesting some carbohydrate, all right? And it was initially, my understanding at least, is that it was initially initially developed to try to help diabetics manage their blood sugar levels. And it's been sort of taken on by the athletes as a way of considering their carbohydrate intake. And if you look at a glycemic index books, they have the carbs split up into 3 groups, a high, a moderate, and a low. This isn't the same as good carbs versus bad carbs, all right? This is purely based on how quickly the carbohydrate in that food enters the bloodstream, all right? So it doesn't mean that it's of poor nutritional value, as you'll see, right? Because there are some odd choices, right? So high means that it's equal to or greater than the index number 70. Rice cakes, I'm always surprised that rice cakes are in there, right? Potatoes, cornflakes, obviously glucose, because that's the thing they use to judge the number by. How quickly does this food go into your bloodstream compared to some pure glucose, okay? And so these foods that are in this high group raise your blood glucose very quickly, and that can lead to a drop in performance in a long-term event, right? Can, if you're not managing your blood glucose during the race, okay? Moderate, 56, 69, so certain cereals, cranberry juice, ice cream, soda. I don't know how soda gets into the moderate group, for example. Corn chips. And then low, oatmeal, banana, baked beans, rye bread, and milk are good examples. Sometimes what you can do, like with your potato here, right? If you add fats to a high glycemic index food, it drops the glycemic load down, right? So if you have your potato and you put baked beans and cheese on your baked potato, then that's going to drop that glycemic load for that potato way down, for example, okay? So the research is quite ambiguous on how you use the glycemic index around training or around performance. High glycemic index foods were recommended for during the performance, because it's like you want to get that glucose into the bloodstream quickly to use it to make ATP. But there is also research out there that says it doesn't matter whether we give you high glycemic or low glycemic, so you can have a fruit bar or a banana and the blood sugar changes are relatively equivalent. So as I said, the data is not clear at the moment. Before exercise, moderate glycemic index foods are recommended. You don't want something before the training or before the performance that is going to spike your blood glucose very quickly, right? So you don't want to be eating high GI foods before training. The recommendation is to eat more moderate levels and maybe, eat those an hour to 2 hours ahead of time. And then during recovery, you can use moderate or high depending on when your next exercise bout is. If your next exercise bout, so if you're doing 2-a-days, right? Or you're in a race where you're in an event where you have to perform more than once a day. then the recommendation is during the recovery phase after the event to use moderate and high to re-establish stored glycogen as quickly as possible. If you've got 24 hours until your next event or your next training session, it doesn't matter what or when you eat, right? By the time, if you're eating a balanced diet, by the time you do your next training session, your glycogen stores should be replenished. Okay, so this was interesting. They've really reduced the amount of information about carb loading in the chapter. So I'm going to go through this. I'm probably not going to spend too much time on the methods and go through this a little bit more quickly, and then we can talk more about when it is actually usable, right? And the reason that they're saying you really don't need to worry too much about carb loading is that for most people, if they're eating a balanced or an athlete a slightly high carb diet, their muscle glycogen is pretty much full, right? The storage space in the muscle tissue is full. But they don't even mention that I could find now Astran's classic carb loading, which I think is a shame, I have to say. It is a historical piece of research, and so I think leaving it out is a little disappointing, because the history behind where we are in our science is always of interest, right? Those people lay the path. Nowadays, if you're going to use a carb loading program, it's much more likely to be relatively consistent carbohydrate content, and then maybe taper off your intensity or your volume just before the event, right? So the 2 days before the event, you only do half the workload or something like that. If you're in an endurance event that is longer than an hour, then there's indication that doing some carb loading is beneficial because your glycogen stores are at optimum at the beginning of the event, right? If you're doing repetitive localized exercise, it might be useful. There's some indication that even bouts of 45, again, the data is, all the data in the nutrition world at the moment is in a bit of flux, right? So even 45-minute type events have been shown to be good. But if you're doing less than 45 minutes, like if I go out to the trail and I'm doing my 35-minute power walk, then I don't need to carb load for that, because I'm not going to deplete my carb stores enough to warrant the carb loading. One of the things you have to be aware of with carb loading is that carbohydrate, as we said way back at the beginning of the semester, is stored with water, right? So you have to find the balance between taking in extra carbs, which also means you're going to store extra fluids, which can add 2, 3, 4 pounds to your weight, right? Which might not be beneficial to the performance, okay? Versus, you know, how do I time it? What type of carb do I take so that I can get maximum glycogen storage with minimum water issues, right? The muscle recruitment to benefit from any type of carb loading has to be long duration, over, most studies are saying over an hour, but the minimum would be over 45 minutes, and repetitive action with very little rest, right? So intermittent events like racquetball or basketball or high volume resistance training might benefit from a little bit of carb loading. So ignore this the red line, ignore the red line, because that's the study they don't include now. But you can see here, this is your regular diet, so we're 6 days out from the event. I'm eating my regular balanced diet with my mixed carbs, and then day 3 I go into a high carb diet. And at this point, probably, maybe even day 4, but certainly day 5 and day 6, I would probably be doing minimum amount of training on those days. Right? Okay, I'm going to stop there because on Friday, I have some time off on Friday, and you are going to watch my recorded lecture, and my recorded lecture starts on this slide. But I wanted to point out some of the new info here. Frustratingly, at least frustrating from a faculty perspective, they've got quite a lot of new information in the chapter, but in the new PowerPoints that come with the book, they don't have the new information. So by the time I had read it, I didn't have time to kind of incorporate it. But there's quite a lot of information. So for example, on page 297, there's 2 new tables here. The first one, table 10.2, is some guidelines for daily carbohydrate intake for athletes. Now, what they've done, and heaven forbid everybody would agree, because that would be asking too much, but what they've done is they've compared the dietary guidelines, which is the 45 to 65%, with guidelines from the International Society of Sport Nutrition, the ACSM, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and the Australian Institute for Sport. So they've got the guidelines from an athlete point of view compared to the generalized guidelines for health, is what I'm going to call them. Okay? They don't agree with each other. One of the things the chapter tries hard to put across is that it's really important that you individualize your dietary intake. So you can't have a program. If you're the track coach, you can't give the same dietary plan to all your 10,000 meter runners, right? It has to be individualized, okay? And they make that really clear. They also talk about the fact that, for different people, carbohydrates are absorbed and utilized differently at different times in the day. So for some people, you might want to have carbohydrate earlier in the day, perhaps, right? Then another table they have is carbohydrate refueling guidelines for acute exercise. So this would be good for training days, okay? And again, they compare, they don't include the Australian Institute this time, but they're comparing the ISSN with the ACSM and NASA, okay? So I think that would be really good information if you're going to work with competitive athletes. If you're going to work in a weight gym and be a personal trainer, I don't know how much you're going to need to get into the kind of sports nutrition. You might be able to manage your clients with the general guidelines, right? And then, where is, or maybe that's further on. Okay, that's further on. There's there's a glycemic index foods table on page 293 that has some more foods in each group so that you can get a good idea of what's in each group. What else came up when I was reading this chapter? Oh yes, okay, let's look at fatigue. What time is it? Okay, I've got time to do this. Okay. So when you're reading the information on fatigue in this carbohydrate portion, I want you to go back and review your crossover principles, okay? Because they play a role here as well. And the more information you can tie together, the better your understanding will be, all right? So, we've got the start of the race, right? And this is going to be a marathon, let's say, right? So we know from our earlier work that at the start of the race, for at least 20 minutes, we're going to be using predominantly carbohydrate, right? And at somewhere around 20 minutes, depending on my diet, and we'll talk more about this, it talks a lot about it as you go through the chapter, that you can be carbohydrate dependent because you have 55% of your diet is carbohydrate, or they also are trying, that I had noticed that they've brought in some more information about high protein and high fat and low carb keto type diets. So we'll get into that. But for somewhere around 20 minutes, if you're on a low carb keto diet, I don't know how much sooner that crossover occurs. That's outside my understanding, but I'm assuming it occurs early enough to make a difference to use that diet, right? Then we're going to cross over at some point, and we're going to use our, our fat source, right? So our stored triglycerides are going to get broken down and pumped into aerobic metabolism, and we're going to use fat as our energy source. Okay. At some point, you either want to pick up your speed, right, or you've been running for such a long time that it is now high intensity, even if you haven't really changed your speed. At some point, we're going to go back to using our carbohydrate, right? And this is where we can hit the wall, as athletes call it, right? So the point at which, so I said earlier that you've got about 2 hours of really hard work, right? 2 hours of really hard work, you're going to see pretty much depletion in both the liver and the muscle stores for glycogen. And when you have no glycogen left, that's when you hit the wall, right? So we hit our wall. That means I've got no more glycogen. That means I have to go back to using fat stores, right? But if I have to go back to using fat stores, I have to run a lot slower. I maybe have to walk or crawl, right? So if you watch a marathon and you watch people who don't understand how to manage their nutrition leading up to the race, then I think the chapter says somewhere around 2% of people that start marathons drop out and don't finish. If you watch the finish of the race, you'll see many, many people struggle that last 200, 100 meters. I mean, literally, they'll be like walking like this, they'll be crawling, people will be carrying them so that they can say they finished the race, right? When you see that happen, that person hit the wall. They completely ran out of carbs, and that means you have to transfer back to using fats, and that means you go very slow, right? At that point, okay? So the goal, when we're talking about carb loading or making sure that our muscle glycogen content is high enough, is that we get to the point where we want to speed up or things are getting tough, and we have enough glycogen left to get us to the end of the race. And we don't hit this wall because we never run out completely. Right? That's the goal. Does that make sense? So, one of the things I found interesting is that they mention we still don't really know the mechanisms that are fully occurring behind the depletion of glycogen and the fatigue and the hitting the wall, right? So when you look on page 295, they've got some options there of hypotheses that people are working on to try to see, like, what's the real picture behind this happening, right? Why does it actually happen? So the first one is, I think, the most obvious, that you have to slow down the rate of energy production when you go back to using fats, right? Because you've depleted your carbs. One that I thought was really interesting was that it's possible that because of the need for glucose and carbohydrate by the central nervous system, that some of that carbohydrate is not going to the working muscle tissue, it's getting diverted to the central nervous system, which I thought was quite an interesting, I hadn't ever considered that. That was an interesting idea. That as the exercise gets harder, this is another obvious one, as the exercise gets harder, we use more and more of our type 2 fibers, right? Because they're the ones that do the high intensity work, and they produce a lot more lactic acid and hydrogen ions, right, and lactose into the bloodstream, and carbon dioxide. We've got carbon dioxide coming from the type 1 muscle fibers that's adding hydrogen ions, And so now we've got this acid buildup as well that could be promoting fatigue, right? So some really interesting work going on in the field of sport nutrition right now. As I say, I don't know, it's really going to depend which population you choose to work with as to whether or not you're going to need these. You know, it's like a tiny, tiny change in mechanics might give you 0.5 of a second, right? But 0.5 of a second can get you a medal in certain events, right? So I think that from my point of view, the nutrition stuff is similar. Like we have the health, a well-balanced diet, we know what that involves, right? We've got our 45 to 65% range. We can use that information to make sure that we've got a balanced diet and be healthy. But if I want to be an elite performer, I need every tool possible to help me out. And so all these new ideas might give me just a little bit of an edge. Okay, so on Friday, since you'll watch my recorded lecture, I will add information if there is more information on Monday, and then on Monday we'll also look at the remainder of the chapter. There's new information at the end of the chapter that I have to try and find time to fit in. I don't know if I'm going to get the time, but there is on page 323 a new section on the microbiome, probiotics and exercise. So again, this is a burgeoning research area trying to understand the digestive system. There's a lot more to the digestive system than we've ever known about before. And so they've added some information in at the end of the chapter. If I can get to it, I will, but we're running out of time. Okay? All right, questions? Is anybody left? Oh yeah, Kevin and Mackenzie are still here. Any questions? How'd your exam go, Mackenzie?
My exam was pretty good. I just had to hop on and finish it real quick before this class started.
No, absolutely. That's no problem at all. No problem. I will be sending out a question. The new edition has caught me unawares slightly. Usually we do nutrition, fluids and electrolytes, training environments, special populations. And in the special populations is all the additional info about working with diabetics or working with people with high blood pressure, and we're not going to have time to do it. So I'm going to send out a question to see whether people would prefer to do the fluid and electrolytes information or whether they would prefer the diabetic, high blood pressure type info. And we'll see which one will stick in. Okay? Anything else you need? Oh, I am halfway through grading the exams. I will finish those this afternoon, and I will have them all loaded back into the grade book later this afternoon. Maybe there was something else. And I think that's it for today. Unless you have things you need me to help you with. going to jump out because I've run late and I've got to walk home and be back in time for 3:15 for office hours, so I'm going to have to run home and right now. All right, take care. Have a good afternoon. And I'll see you tomorrow for lab.
Yes, ma'am. Bye-bye.
Bye.